What if a single sentence, spoken not in anger but in calm conviction, could silence a president, ignite a global movement, and redefine what true leadership looks like? This isn't a speech. It's a moment that crossed oceans, broke barriers, and reminded the world that dignity can be louder than power. Stay with us, because what you're about to witness will change the way you see leadership forever. Dear friends, what you're about to hear is more than just a story. It's a glimpse into a world where quiet courage reshapes destinies and dignity outshines power. These are the voices often missed by the headlines, but not here. If this kind of storytelling moves you, if it stays with you long after the screen fades, we invite you to subscribe and ring the bell. And before we dive in, tell us where you're watching from. We read every word. Now let's begin. The sun had barely lifted over the rooftops of Ouagadougou, casting a golden haze across the quiet city streets, when President Ibrahim Traoré took his seat in his modest office. On the surface, it was a morning like any other. Routine reports, a briefing on rural development programs, and a scheduled virtual roundtable with a handful of international dignitaries. Nothing out of the ordinary, nothing that signaled the emotional thunderstorm about to roll in. He adjusted his glasses, glanced over the agenda, and sipped tea brewed by his sister, who still lived in the outskirts of the city. There was no sense of premonition, no inkling that one voice, thousands of miles away, would bring the room and him to a full stop. Across the Atlantic, in a small conference room in Washington, D.C., Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett checked her microphone. Her team had prepared talking points. She pushed them aside. She wasn't coming to offer platitudes or polished policy alignment. Something deeper had been stirring in her ever since she first read about Traoré's decision to reject international loans in favor of self-funded education programs. It reminded her of home, of Detroit, of watching her community get written out of conversations year after year. She took a breath, not to calm herself, but to center what she needed to say. And when the screen blinked on and she began to speak, time seemed to hesitate. It wasn't her eloquence. It wasn't even the unexpected tenderness in her tone. It was the undeniable weight behind her words, the quiet power of someone who has known what it means to be overlooked and yet still shows up to honor another who chooses to serve. President Traoré glanced up from his notes. What had begun as another checkbox in a long day of diplomacy had shifted into something else, something electric, charged and irreversible. No one in the room, not his advisers, not the foreign delegates, and certainly not the man himself, could have anticipated that this moment would echo far beyond the walls of that virtual meeting. History rarely announces itself with a drum roll. Sometimes it arrives gently in the form of a woman who refuses to be forgettable. When Jasmine Crockett finally spoke, her voice didn't rise, it reached. It reached across cables and satellites, across borders and biases, across assumptions layered over time. Her tone wasn't grandiose, but there was nothing small about it. "Mr. President," she began, "this isn't about politics, it's about something far more sacred. It's about dignity." The room fell silent, not the kind of silence born from protocol, but the kind that descends when everyone knows something is happening that they'll never forget. Jasmine didn't read from notes, she didn't posture or persuade, she simply told the truth. She spoke of Burkina Faso not in terms of its GDP or challenges, but of its soul. She honored the audacity of its leadership in turning down loans that promised relief but masked dependency. She lifted up the vision behind choosing long-term investment in education over short-term validation. "What you've done," she said, "is not just governance, it's defiance rooted in care. But what transformed her words from admiration into connection was what she offered next, herself. She spoke not as a politician, but as a daughter of Detroit, raised in neighborhoods long overlooked, where hope was a fragile thing people held tight because no one else would. She told them she understood what it meant to feel unseen by systems and unheard by those in power. "That's why I recognize what you're doing," she said. "Because I've lived in places where leaders don't choose their people first." There was no condescension in her praise, no savior narrative, just a mirror, lifted gently across the ocean, reflecting back the courage so often ignored in the global north. Jasmine wasn't idealizing Ibrahim Traoré. She was identifying something rare in him, and rare in herself too. "When you lead with dignity," she concluded, "you give others permission to hope, and hope, when honored, becomes action." No one interrupted her, not a cough, not a shuffle. Just the quiet reverence of people who had just witnessed something more than a speech. They had heard their own stories told back to them with respect. And for a few sacred minutes, borders disappeared. Only truth remained. For a long, breathless moment, no one spoke. Ibrahim Traoré sat frozen, not in confusion, but in awe, his hands resting on the wooden arms of his chair as though anchoring himself to something real. Jasmine Crockett's words hadn't been loud, they hadn't been dramatic, but they had dismantled the quiet cynicism that so often lingers in diplomatic spaces, the sense that nothing truly honest can survive here. And yet here it was, honesty offered with grace, and it had left a head of state unable to speak. Around him, ministers and advisers glanced at one another, unsure whether to speak or sit still. Even the interpreters paused, their voices caught in their throats, as if translating something that's sacred would somehow diminish it. The silence in the room grew thick, not awkward, but reverent. When Traoré finally stood, he did so slowly, like a man who understood the moment required more than a routine response. He reached for the microphone, then pulled his hand back, then reached again. He looked into the camera, not as a president, but as a son of this land, of Burkinabe soil, and its people's unyielding spirit. "I have spoken to many leaders," he began, his voice breaking at the edges, "but I have never heard my people described with such dignity from so far away." He didn't offer political points. He didn't retreat into caution. He spoke plainly, emotionally, with gratitude and disbelief. "Miss Crockett," he said, "you didn't just speak to me. You spoke to my grandmother who sold groundnuts in Bobo Dioulasso. You spoke to the teachers in Banfora who haven't missed a day of school in a year. You saw us." It wasn't applause that followed. It was something deeper. Jasmine simply nodded, her eyes misted. There was no victory to claim, only a moment to hold. The internet would catch fire hours later. Hashtags, headlines, highlight reels. But inside that room, at that exact second, all that mattered was that someone had spoken truth and someone else had recognized it. And in that shared silence, something rare had happened. They had made each other visible. What happened in that quiet virtual chamber did not stay contained. Within hours, the clip of Jasmine Crockett's remarks and Ibrahim Traoré's wordless reaction was everywhere, not just trending, reverberating, the kind of moment that moved through the internet not like a headline, but like a heartbeat. On TikTok, teenagers stitched Jasmine's voice over images of protest and perseverance. On Twitter, academics broke down her rhetoric, calling it a new model for diplomacy rooted in equity, not ego. But this wasn't just a viral moment. It was the spark of something deeper. In Lagos, a group of young lawmakers began their weekly policy forum with a reading of Jasmine's speech. In Nairobi, a women-led coalition launched a digital series called Lead with Dignity, inspired by her words. Across the African continent, student unions organized live-stream debates around the ethics of international aid, using her speech as a framework. The language she used, unapologetic yet respectful, had become a blueprint for a new kind of leadership, not performative, but principled. Meanwhile, back in Washington, Jasmine faced a different kind of storm. Some colleagues accused her of romanticizing foreign leaders. Pundits questioned her patriotism, but when she was pressed during a live interview in New York, she didn't flinch. "I'm not romanticizing anyone," she said firmly. "I'm acknowledging what courage looks like when it shows up where it's least expected and where it's most needed." Her words, again, traveled. Not as sound bites, but as seeds. Inspired by the response, Jasmine and her team quietly launched an initiative called Voice Across Borders, a program designed to create digital town halls between American legislators and grassroots leaders in the global South. The idea wasn't to talk, it was to listen. The first session drew over 10,000 participants from 5 continents. Meanwhile, in Ouagadougou, youth leaders created a campaign called Lead Loud, Live Soft, a tribute to Traoré's steady leadership and the kind of quiet conviction that Jasmine had amplified. The campaign quickly spread across Francophone West Africa, promoting civic engagement and emotional intelligence in politics. This wasn't just a story anymore, it was a shift, a redefinition of what it means to lead, and more importantly, who gets to be heard. The ceremony in Banfora was modest by state standards, no flashing lights, no red carpets, no booming anthems, just people, farmers, teachers, elders, children, seated beneath a canvas canopy as the late afternoon sun dipped into the horizon. A breeze carried with it the quiet hum of a community that had come to witness something far bigger than a political milestone. They came to honor a feeling that had, for once, reached them without distortion. Recognition. On a small wooden stage, President Ibrahim Traoré stood beside a digital screen where Jasmine Crockett appeared, smiling from thousands of miles away. He held in his hand a carved statue, 2 figures in an embrace, their arms fused into a circle, the inscription clear and deliberate. Respect builds bridges. Traoré turned toward the crowd, his voice low but deliberate. "Too often," he said, "leadership is measured by how loudly we speak, how firmly we command. But today I was reminded that the true strength of leadership is not how many follow you, but how many feel seen because of you." The crowd listened, not as subjects but as citizens. And when he gestured to Jasmine's image, he didn't speak of partnerships or foreign relations, he spoke of humility. She did not arrive with a solution, she arrived with a question. What if dignity was the starting point? Jasmine, watching the stream live, wiped a tear from her cheek. When she was invited to speak, she had not planned to spark a movement. She had simply chosen to tell the truth. And now, as she listened to Traoré's words echo across that crowd, she understood that the power of her speech had never come from eloquence. It came from listening first. Her own words, broadcast from a quiet office in Washington, had found their way into classrooms in Cotonou, kitchens in Dakar, and dusty radios in rural Ghana. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. Leadership, she now understood, is not about being in front. It's about knowing when to step aside, when to amplify, when to honor. And sometimes the most radical act of leadership is to simply hear someone into existence. In the span of just a few minutes, Jasmine Crockett did more than deliver a speech. She altered the emotional architecture of what global leadership can look like. What began as a standard diplomatic meeting transformed into a reckoning with truth, dignity, and the invisible threads that tie people across oceans. In speaking not from a script but from her lived experience, Jasmine reached across borders and histories and offered something few politicians ever do: sincere recognition. Ibrahim Traoré, a leader who had long been underestimated by global narratives, was left speechless not because he was caught off guard, but because someone had finally seen him beyond the lens of foreign policy or strategic interest. Jasmine didn't arrive with advice, she arrived with acknowledgement. That small shift, away from presumption toward presence, ignited a wave of solidarity that transcended political tribes, continents, and generations. What unfolded afterward was not just social media buzz, it was transformation. Her words became a blueprint for grassroots movements, student forums, and cross-border initiatives. His reaction, a pause filled with meaning, became a symbol of humility that carries weight in a world addicted to noise. Together, without intention, they showed the world that leadership is not always about leading. Sometimes it's about listening so deeply that others feel brave enough to speak. So, what do we take from this? The lesson is both timeless and urgent. Visibility is power. Not the kind of power that dominates, but the kind that heals. When we see others fully, especially those whose stories have been ignored or rewritten, we do more than empathize. We participate in their restoration. In your daily life, this means asking better questions, listening not to reply but to understand. It means recognizing that people carry untold histories in their silence and honoring them by how you choose to respond. Whether you're in a boardroom or on a street corner, the opportunity to lead with dignity is always present. All it asks is that you show up with your full humanity. Now it's your turn to reflect. Question for you. What made Jasmine Crockett's speech so powerful? A. Her command of policy details and international law. B. Her authenticity, humility, and ability to connect through shared human experience. Comment your answer, A or B, below. We want to hear what you think. And while you're at it, let's talk. Has there ever been a time someone truly heard you and it changed the way you saw yourself? Or have you ever done that for someone else? Drop your stories in the comments so we can grow from each other's voices. If this story moved you, inspired you, or simply made you pause, consider subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that don't just inform but transform. And trust us, the next one might just be the one you needed to hear.